Raymond Mitchell's mornings always started the same way, with the screech of his screen door at precisely 0600. Even after 15 years of retirement, his body clock remained stubbornly set to Navy time. His three-bedroom ranch house on the outskirts of Virginia Beach had become his sanctuary, its walls adorned with faded photographs of ships and crews from another era. Ray's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he settled into his porch chair, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and orange. The morning dew reminded him of countless dawns spent on watch, the salt spray mixing with the morning moisture on destroyer decks. 32 years in the Navy had left their mark on him, both visible and invisible. The severe burns that covered the left side of his face told the story of that fateful day in '67 aboard the Forrestal. The ship's historian had documented how Chief Mitchell had rushed into the burning compartment 3 times, dragging out junior sailors who would have otherwise perished. The official report noted his extraordinary courage under extreme conditions, but it didn't mention the months of recovery, the pain that never quite went away, or the nightmares that still visited him decades later. His wife Margaret had passed 5 years ago, leaving him alone with his memories and his routines. Every Tuesday he still volunteered at the Naval Museum, sharing stories with wide-eyed school children about the real meaning of service. Some would stare at his scars, but Ray had long ago learned to smile through their curiosity. "Every scar tells a story," he'd say. "And every story teaches us something about who we want to become." As he limped through his morning routine, Ray's thoughts drifted to the upcoming Fleet Week ceremonies. He'd been invited as a guest of honor, though these events had become increasingly difficult for him. The world had changed, and sometimes he felt like a relic from a different era. Still, he pressed his dress blues and polished his medals, knowing that tomorrow he would once again stand proud, representing a generation of sailors who had given everything for their country. Little did he know that tomorrow's ceremony would become more than just another military event. It would become a moment of redemption, dignity, and unexpected alliance with a young man who understood the true meaning of respect. The morning of Fleet Week dawned bright and clear over Naval Station Norfolk, the world's largest naval base. The sprawling complex hummed with anticipation as sailors in their dress whites scurried about, making final preparations for the day's ceremonies. American flags snapped crisply in the Virginia breeze, their shadows dancing across the gleaming hulls of aircraft carriers and destroyers lined up along the piers like silent sentinels. Raymond Mitchell adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the familiar knot. His dress, blues, still fit, though perhaps a bit more snugly than in years past. The medals and ribbons on his chest caught the early morning light streaming through his bedroom window, each one a chapter in a story, spanning more than 3 decades of service. "Looking sharp, Chief," he muttered to his reflection, an old habit from his days of inspecting junior sailors. The man in the mirror stared back, his scarred face a roadmap of sacrifice. Ray had long ago accepted his appearance, but some days were harder than others. Today, surrounded by young sailors in their pristine uniforms, he knew his scars would draw attention. The drive to the base took longer than usual, the roads clogged with families and visitors, eager to participate in the Fleet Week celebrations. Ray's invitation designated him as a distinguished veteran guest, complete with priority parking near the main ceremony grounds. As he eased his aging Buick into the spot, a young petty officer approached with a wheelchair. "Good morning, Chief Mitchell. I'm Petty Officer Santos. Would you like some assistance?" Ray waved him off with a gentle smile. "Thank you, son. But these legs still work. Might be slow, but they'll get me there." The ceremony grounds had been transformed into an impressive display of naval pageantry. Rows of white chairs faced a raised platform adorned with naval flags and bunting. Behind the stage, the massive superstructure of the USS Gerald R. Ford provided a fitting backdrop, its radar arrays and communication masts reaching into the cloudless sky. As Ray made his way to his designated seat in the front row, he couldn't help but notice the mix of attendees. There were the usual faces: local politicians, active duty personnel, and family members. But this year's crowd seemed different. A contingent of students from various military academies occupied several rows, their young faces bright with ambition and promise. Among them sat Barron Trump, though Ray wouldn't have recognized him if not for the whispers that followed the tall young man. The former president's youngest son had grown into an imposing figure, his height and bearing drawing natural attention. Unlike some of his peers who fidgeted in their seats, Barron sat with a composed stillness that reminded Ray of the old-school officers he'd served under. The ceremony began with the traditional colors presentation, the bass band striking up "Anchors Away" as the flags were marched in. Ray stood with practiced precision, his hand finding his heart with the muscle memory of countless similar moments. But as he lowered himself back into his seat, his knee buckled slightly, causing him to drop harder than intended. That's when he heard them. The whispers and poorly suppressed snickers from a group of young attendees seated a few rows back. "Check out Freddy Krueger in dress blues," one voice muttered, followed by muffled laughter. "Bet that's why they stopped letting him drive ships," another added. "Probably couldn't see out of that side anyway." The words landed like physical blows, each one striking deeper than the last. Ray kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral, a skill learned through years of maintaining military bearing. But inside, something crumbled. These weren't just random civilians. These were future naval officers, the next generation of military leadership. The ceremony continued with speeches about naval tradition and the importance of service. Admiral Catherine Chen, the base commander, spoke eloquently about the sacrifices of past generations. Ray listened, but the words seemed distant now, drowned out by the echo of those whispers and the growing weight of isolation. During a pause in the proceedings, as the band prepared for the next musical selection, the whispered commentary continued. Ray could feel eyes on him, studying his scars, judging his slower movements. He thought of standing up, of walking away with whatever dignity he could muster, but something kept him rooted in place. He hadn't abandoned his post in Vietnam, hadn't fled the flames on the Forrestal, and he wouldn't retreat now. Behind him, the group had grown bolder, their whispers carrying further. "Maybe they should have a separate section for the horror show veterans," one of them suggested, triggering another round of suppressed laughter. What they didn't notice was Barron Trump's growing attention to their commentary. The tall young man had shifted in his seat, his expression darkening with each passing remark. He had been raised in the public eye, had seen firsthand how cruel people could be, and had developed a particular sensitivity to bullying in all its forms. As the band struck up "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," the Navy hymn, Ray felt tears threatening to form, not from the cruel words, but from the memories the hymn always stirred. Faces of shipmates long gone, the sound of general quarters, the smell of smoke and fear in cramped compartments. He blinked them back, maintaining his composure as he'd been trained to do. The ceremony was building toward its culmination, with several veterans scheduled to receive special recognition. Ray's name would be among them, his actions aboard the Forrestal finally receiving a long overdue public acknowledgement. But now, instead of pride, he felt only exposure and vulnerability. The thought of walking across that stage, of being the focus of all those eyes, including those who had made their opinions of him so clear, filled him with a dread he hadn't felt since those desperate moments in '67. What Ray couldn't know was that the next few minutes would transform this moment of personal humiliation into something entirely unexpected. Behind him, Barron Trump had made a decision, his jaw set with determination. The young man's hand was already raised, catching the attention of the ceremony coordinator, even as Admiral Chen prepared to begin the recognition portion of the event. The whispers continued, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson about judgment, respect, and the true meaning of service, delivered by someone they'd never expected to become involved. As Admiral Chen concluded her remarks, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the ceremony's atmosphere. Barron Trump had quietly risen from his seat, his impressive height casting a shadow that drew immediate attention. Without saying a word, he made his way to the group of mockers, his movement deliberate and measured. The young cadets who had been whispering fell silent as Barron approached. At 6 feet 7 inches, his presence was impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just his physical stature that commanded attention. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity inherited perhaps from years of public scrutiny, that made the group straighten in their seats. "Gentlemen," Barron's voice was low but clear, pitched perfectly so that only they could hear. "I'd like you to join me for a moment." It wasn't a request. The 4 cadets exchanged glances but stood, their previous bravado diminishing with each passing second. Barron led them away from the main ceremony toward the base's Memorial Hall. The building stood as a testament to naval history, its walls lined with photographs, citations, and memories of service members who had given everything for their country. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the marble floors as they entered. He stopped in front of a large display case. Inside was a yellowed newspaper from 1967, its headline reading, "Horror Aboard USS Forrestal. Heroes emerge in Navy's darkest hour." Below it sat a damaged chief's cap, its edge singed and discolored. "That's Chief Mitchell's cover," Barron said, gesturing to the cap. "The one he was wearing when he ran into a burning compartment. Not once, but 3 times." He turned to face the group, his expression stern but not angry. The temperature in that space was over 1,000 degrees. The metal was literally melting. The cadets shifted uncomfortably as Barron continued. "Look at these photos." He directed their attention to a series of black and white images showing the aftermath of the Forrestal disaster. Chief Mitchell saved 3 men that day. 3 men who went home to their families, who had children, who had grandchildren, all because one man decided their lives were worth more than his own safety. One of the cadets, the one who'd made the Freddy Krueger comment, had gone pale. "Sir, we didn't know." "That's right, you didn't know," Barron interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of intensity. "You didn't know that the man you were mocking received the Navy and Marine Corps medal for his actions that day. You didn't know that he spent 6 months in the burn ward, enduring surgeries that would have broken most men. You didn't know that he returned to active duty and served another 20 years, mentoring countless sailors who went on to become leaders in our fleet." He stepped closer to the group, his height now truly imposing. "But here's what concerns me most. You didn't think you needed to know. You saw his scars and decided that was all you needed to see. In doing so, you failed one of the most fundamental tests of leadership, the ability to look beyond the surface and recognize the worth of those who serve alongside you." The memorial hall had grown quiet, the only sound the distant muffled voice of the ceremony speaker through the walls. Barron moved to another display case, this one containing Chief Mitchell's service record. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a long list of commendations and achievements. Every one of these entries represents lives touched, missions accomplished, sailors trained. Behind those scars you mocked is a legacy that has helped shape the very Navy you aspire to serve in. The cadets stood in silence, the weight of their actions finally settling on their shoulders. The youngest of them, barely 18, had tears in his eyes. "Sir," one of them finally spoke up, We were completely out of line. Is there any way we can make this right? Barron's expression softened slightly. That's the first good question you've asked today. He glanced at his watch, then back at the group. The recognition ceremony is about to begin. Chief Mitchell will be honored for his service. You have a choice to make about how you'll respond to that moment. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. Remember this: the measure of a person isn't found in their appearance or their scars. It's found in their actions, especially in moments when they think no one of consequence is watching. His eyes met each of theirs in turn. You're about to return to that ceremony. Show him what kind of officers you truly want to become. As they walked back toward the ceremony grounds, the group moved with a different energy. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by something else, perhaps the first stirrings of genuine understanding. What they didn't realize was that Barron's intervention was just the beginning. The speech he would deliver next would transform not just their perspective, but the entire ceremony's meaning. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a profound silence that spoke volumes. As they retook their seats, Barron caught Chief Mitchell's eye and offered a slight nod. The old sailor returned it, unaware of what had transpired, but sensing a shift in the atmosphere around him. The stage was now set for a moment that would be remembered long after the flags were lowered and the crowds had gone home. The ceremony had reached the point where distinguished guests were invited to share brief remarks. Admiral Chen was about to move on to the awards presentation when Baron Trump raised his hand, requesting permission to speak. The unexpected gesture created a ripple of interest through the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Baron began, his voice carrying naturally across the grounds as he stepped onto the stage. "I wasn't scheduled to speak today, but there are moments in life when silence becomes a form of betrayal." He paused, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure against the backdrop of the aircraft carrier. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the ceremony grounds. Today we gather to honor service and sacrifice. These aren't just words on a program or phrases we repeat out of tradition. They are living, breathing realities embodied by the men and women sitting among us. His eyes found Ray Mitchell in the front row. "I'd like to tell you about one of them." The crowd settled into an attentive silence as Barron continued. In July 1967, a young Chief Petty Officer named Raymond Mitchell was serving aboard the USS Forrestal. He had already given 12 years of his life to the Navy, had already proven his worth in countless ways. But on that day, he would be called to demonstrate a level of courage that most of us can only imagine. Barron's voice took on a deeper resonance as he recounted the events. When the fire broke out, the temperature in the affected compartments reached over 1,000 degrees. The deck plates were literally melting. Most people's instinct would be to run away. Chief Mitchell ran toward the danger. In the front row, Ray sat perfectly still, his scarred hands clasped tightly in his lap. The young cadets who had mocked him earlier were now leaning forward, their faces etched with shame and dawning understanding. 3 times he entered that inferno. 3 times he emerged carrying a fellow sailor. When asked later why he went back, knowing the risk, knowing the cost, his response was simple: because they needed help. Barron paused, letting the words sink in. Because they needed help. 5 words that embody the very essence of service. The young man's voice grew more passionate as he continued. Look at the men and women around you today. Some wear their sacrifices visibly, in scars, in missing limbs, in bodies shaped by the toll of service. Others carry their sacrifices invisibly, in memories that wake them at night, in the quiet burden of decisions made in moments of crisis, in the accumulated weight of years given in service to something greater than themselves. Barron stepped away from the podium, moving to the edge of the stage. But here's what I want you to understand. These marks of service, whether visible or invisible, are not imperfections to be mocked or burdens to be pitied. They are medals of honor, more precious than any we could pin on a uniform. They are physical testimony to the truth that real heroes don't wear capes or possess superpowers. They wear scars and carry memories, and they keep showing up day after day to serve others. The silence in the crowd had deepened. Several veterans were wiping tears from their eyes. The group of cadets who had mocked Ray earlier sat with heads bowed, the full weight of their earlier behavior crushing down on them. I never served in uniform, Barron acknowledged, but I grew up understanding the weight of public service, the burden of scrutiny, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Today I stand here not as someone's son or as a public figure, but as an American who recognizes that we owe a debt that can never be fully repaid to people like Chief Mitchell. He turned directly to Ray. Chief, your scars tell a story. They speak of a moment when one man chose to place the lives of others above his own comfort, above his own safety, above everything else. They remind us that true beauty is found not in perfection, but in sacrifice. Not in avoiding pain, but in enduring it for the sake of others. Barron's voice softened, becoming more intimate despite the size of the crowd. In an age where we too often mistake appearance for worth and comfort for achievement, we desperately need these reminders. We need men and women who bear the marks of their courage without shame. We need their stories, their example, their continued presence among us. The young cadets who had mocked Ray were now openly crying. One of them stood up, followed by another and another, until the entire group was standing. Slowly, others in the crowd began to rise as well, until everyone was on their feet. So today, Barron concluded, his voice ringing with emotion, we don't just honor the service of these veterans. We honor their scars, visible and invisible. We honor their sacrifices, past and ongoing. And most importantly, we commit ourselves to being worthy of their example. He turned to Ray one final time. Chief Mitchell, on behalf of a grateful nation, and particularly on behalf of my generation, who too often forgets the price of the freedom we enjoy, thank you. Thank you for your scars. Thank you for your service. Thank you for showing us what real courage looks like. The applause that followed was deafening, rolling across the ceremony grounds like thunder. But more powerful than the applause was the sight of Ray Mitchell, standing tall, despite his limp, tears streaming down his scarred face, receiving at last the full measure of respect his sacrifice had earned. The ceremony would continue, but something fundamental had changed. In the span of one unexpected speech, shame had been transformed into honor, mockery into reverence, and an ordinary military ceremony into a moment none present would ever forget. 6 months after the Fleet Week ceremony, Raymond Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The morning light filtered through the high windows, casting a warm glow over the sea of midshipmen in their dress uniforms. In the front row sat Barron Trump, who had helped organize this unprecedented event. Leadership, Ray began, his voice steady and clear, isn't about perfection. It's about perspective. His scarred hands rested lightly on the podium as he surveyed the young faces before him. Each one represented the future of the Navy he had served for so many years. The story of what happened at Fleet Week had spread through the naval community like wildfire. What began as a moment of cruelty transformed by courage had evolved into something much more significant: the Honor Guard program, a new initiative that paired veteran sailors with midshipmen and officer candidates. Behind Ray, a large screen displayed photographs from the first Honor Guard gathering. Veterans of different eras stood alongside their young counterparts, each pair representing a bridge between generations. The program had started small, just 20 veterans and 20 midshipmen, but it had quickly grown to include hundreds of participants across multiple naval installations. When I joined the Navy in 1955, Ray continued, nobody talked about the invisible wounds of service. Nobody discussed the weight we carry long after we take off the uniform. He paused, touching the scars on his face. And some of us carry visible reminders that make those conversations impossible to avoid. The group of cadets who had mocked him at Fleet Week were also present, but they weren't sitting in the audience. Instead, they stood along the walls of the auditorium, each one wearing a special Honor Guard pin. Their journey from that moment of shame to becoming the program's most dedicated advocates had been remarkable. James Cooper, the cadet who had made the cruelest joke that day, now served as the program's student coordinator. His transformation had been the most profound. Chief Mitchell taught me that our worst moments don't have to define us, he had written in the program's first newsletter. They can inspire us to become better. Barron's involvement hadn't ended with his speech either. He had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his influence to secure funding and support for the Honor Guard program. More importantly, he had helped design its core principle, that every scar, physical or emotional, carried a lesson crucial for future naval leaders. Today, Ray announced, I'm proud to share that the Honor Guard program will become a permanent part of naval officer training. Every midshipman will be paired with a veteran mentor for their entire 4 years at the Academy. The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. The program had already shown remarkable results. Midshipmen reported deeper understanding of naval traditions and challenges. Veterans found new purpose in sharing their experiences. But perhaps most significantly, the culture around visible injuries and disabilities within the naval community had begun to shift. After the presentation, Ray found himself surrounded by midshipmen eager to hear more of his stories. The hesitation and discomfort that had once accompanied looks at his scars had been replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Each question they asked showed a deeper understanding of service and sacrifice. Later that afternoon, Ray and Barron walked slowly along the Academy's historic campus. The young man who had stood up for him had become a trusted friend, their unlikely alliance forging a path for others to follow. Did you ever imagine, Barron asked, that something good could come from that day? Ray stopped, looking out over the Severn River where sailing teams practiced in the distance. In the Navy, he replied, we have a saying, calm seas never made a skilled sailor. Sometimes it takes a storm to show us what's possible. A group of midshipmen passed by, each one rendering a crisp salute. Ray returned it with practiced precision, his scarred face breaking into a warm smile. The same scars that had once drawn mockery now commanded respect, not despite their presence, but because of what they represented. The Honor Guard program would go on to become one of the most significant innovations in naval officer training of the decade. Its success led to similar programs in other branches of the military, each one built on the understanding that the most valuable lessons often come from those who bear the marks of their service. As the sun set over Annapolis that evening, Ray Mitchell stood at parade rest before Memorial Hall. His reflection in the polished marble showed not just his scars, but the legacy they had helped create. Behind him, A new plaque hung on the wall, bearing the Honor Guard's motto, "Through their scars, we learn. Through their stories, we grow. Through their sacrifice, we understand." The old sailor smiled, remembering the flames of the Forrestal, the whispers at Fleet Week, and the speech that had changed everything. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories come not from avoiding life's battles, but from transforming them into something that helps others find their way.